next presenter is LaPortia J. Perkins. She's Florida-born, Virginia-raised wildlife forester, social scientist, artist, and poet. She holds a BS in wildlife and fisheries biology with a minor in environmental science and policy from Clemson University and MS in forestry from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. LaPortia's job and work center from the African diasporic experience with land management and nature in the Southeast with a focus on storytelling and connection. With that, LaPortia, I hand it off to you.
Alrighty, so hi everyone, my name is LaPortia Perkins and I'm a federal, thank you for the great intro, that kind of says a lot about me, but I'm a federal lands associate at Defenders of Wildlife, which is shown up in that corner, based here in Washington, D.C., and I'm also a 2020 forestry grad of Virginia Tech, and today I'll be presenting my thesis research, Prescribed Fire Perspectives of African-American Landowners in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. This work was sponsored by Virginia Tech, Tall Timbers, and the Edna Bailey Sussman Fund. And while this study focuses on 3 lower southeastern states, the history still pertains to the Southeast as a whole, and hopefully the results will relate to similar findings and knowledge in North Carolina, especially what has been discussed today at the workshop. So just to provide some context on where I'm positioned in this work, I spent a lot of time in the Southeast growing up. I was born in Tampa, Florida, and I was raised between Tampa, Florida, Tallahassee, Virginia Beach, Virginia, and outside of Augusta, Georgia in the woods, along with attending college in Clemson, South Carolina. So the landscapes and ecosystems of these areas are really familiar to me. And in doing this project, my ancestral heritage became strongly attached to understanding Black land ownership and fire. I'm a first-generation grandchild of Wilhelmina Gammons, who's the eldest of 14 from a sharecropping family in Marianna, Florida. And I'm privy to a slew of Black landowners, including aunts, uncles, my mother, and fellow cousins. And again, I've roamed the longleaf pine forest since I was a child. And so the image above is done by a local watercolor artist from the Red Hills region, which I'm talking about today, that constitutes the area of Georgia, Florida, and Alabama that I'll be reviewing. And his name is Aluster Richardson, and he depicts through watercolor the lives of tenant farmers and other facets of daily life for Black people in that time. With my understanding of longleaf pine ecosystems and decades-long suppression in the region, my focus and my understanding of prescribed fire, along with my advisor, was that we needed to find, we started to notice a trend in information gathering on prescribed fire, and this increased prevalence of prescribed fire on these large entities, on plantations, on acreages that was happening year after year, for example, the Jones Center. But there was little information that was being collected about reasons for prescribed fire use by private landowners, and especially information collected on private landowners of color. So we weren't able to find substantial information in survey data. And so a base justification for this assertion was an article titled "Perspectives on Prescribed Fire in the South, Does Ethnicity Matter?" Leem et al. Is a 2009 article, among others that I read and have noted in my work, where there were high percentages of negative appeal around prescribed fire and scenic quality, smoke liability, and harms to fish of wildlife, with especially low numbers of respondents of color. And in that survey specifically, it was Hispanic and African Americans. So I decided it would be great to simply create this firsthand account with as many African American non-industrial private landowners as I could in a single summer for research to understand their perspectives better. And so I set off to do this study, and I conducted in-person and telephone interviews with African American, African descendant, non-industrial private landowners. And I asked the overall question: what factors affect the decision of African American non-industrial private landowners to use prescribed fire as a land management technique? So it can be a little hard to answer or even ask this question without understanding the history of African Americans and Afro-descendants in their ancestry and their journey to land ownership, and that collision with the use of prescribed fire, because they come into the historical narrative at 2 different times. So here I show a timeline with significant legislative, organizational, and fluctuations in land ownership that is specific to the African-American diaspora experience. So while the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 and even Juneteenth in 1865 meant a somewhat ending to a long era as enslaved people, there was no true escape for Black people in the South if they hadn't had the resources originally to either move north or start new careers or potentially evade the rampant and discriminatory justice system that was around in that time. So naturally, they returned to working conditions on the land with debt associated or succumb to abhorrent treatment and the dangers of the Jim Crow South and Black Code. So then opportunities began to present hope for formerly enslaved Black people. And among those were the Morrill Acts, which I show here in 1862 and again in 1890, that provided funding for land grant institutions that began to teach agricultural and mechanical skills. Schools like what now are Tuskegee University and Florida A&M or FAMU are among some of these initial institutions. And then came along this access to money or financial credit to purchase land, which became available through the Freedmen's Bureau of Beaufort, South Carolina. And then support services like cooperative extension, or separately because cooperative extension wasn't integrated for a while, the Negro Extension Service, which operated out of Tuskegee University, they were created. So now you have this financial, educational, and state support for land purchases. And then as well, there are these heirs that increased the land ownership for African Americans entering into the 1910s. So with all this being said, there's still this underlying issue that's happening in this time whereby if there were African American Afro-descendants who did have property before, they're running into these heirs property situations if people have passed. And so now heirs property, along with these other means of accessing land ownership, are happening at the same time. At the same time, there's discrimination happening among this whole group of people as they're trying to invest and advance themselves collectively, collect land, and then now have this next step of like, what is this land management? What is my land management goals going to be? What am I going to do with my land? And a lot of it starts as, say, row crop agriculture or what they were doing before, but then a cool guy comes along in the midst, and his name is Herbert L. Stoddard. And so Herbert L. Stoddard, he's a prominent conservationist and forest ecologist of the time, and he worked adamantly to establish the importance of the forest management method of prescribed fire, especially at tall timbers, especially in Tallahassee, especially off of Plantation Parkway, where all of these rich Northerners were now coming down to embed themselves not only in this landscape, in this ecosystem, but also to benefit off this new hunting culture that was happening there that mostly revolved around bobwhite quail. And bobwhite quail ultimately benefited off of this prescribed fire ecosystem. So burning the woods in general, though, prior to Herbert L. Stoddard being there, was a normal practice by indigenous peoples like the Seminole Nation or the Muskogee Creek Nation, and their knowledge of the land and similar knowledge was shared by sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and landowners, whether it was through direct interaction that we may have historical recounts of, or just simply an understanding of how the ecosystem works, and most notably, pest control. So even so, given the harsh racial climate, difficulties with extension, difficulties with agricultural resources and support, and even the long haul of the civil rights era were enough to cause a steady decline in African American non-industrial private landowners, along with the issue of heirs property, which I discussed before. And just to give a more concrete definition for heirs property, for those who may not know, it's a legal term for land that is owned by two or more people with a common ancestor who has passed without leaving a will, and is the leading cause of involuntary land loss among African Americans going into the 2000s. So just to sort of get into this rapid land loss, the decline has not let up since we've entered the 21st century. So first you see here and all of these are in descending order going down. So in 1910 from the Ag Census, there's about 247,000 plus titled Negro and other non-farm operators in Alabama, Georgia, Florida alone. And so this is in this group because some are tenant farmers, some may own their land through other means, but a lot of these are like pure landowners who have them and are owning and operating farms for various means. Then it changes down to in 1999, so at the end of that century, 68,000 plus Black landowners. And then just in 2017, and another agricultural census will come out next year, but to 28,000 plus Black or African American landowners in the US, covering 2.4 million acres of land and making up less than 2% of US owned land or being the principal producer. So what this means is that the last agricultural census in 2017 is pretty much showing a 90% decrease in African American owned land. And in 2022, we hope to maybe see an uptick in these numbers given the current climate that we're in and advances being made in land ownership and again in fire use as management. So with this being said, we'll get into the study objectives. So on the left and the right, I show some elements of prescribed fire in the Georgia, Florida, and Alabama area. So this is at Pebble Hill Plantation, which is just outside of Thomasville, Georgia, and just outside of Tallahassee, Florida. And then the other is of Kruger National Park in South Africa. And so each of these burns were done 10 years apart in different areas, but through similar methods and of similar severities and with similar outcomes. So not only am I showing these fires to show that the elements of using prescribed fire transcends just necessarily our national walls, but also that a similar organization doing the same thing in two different areas, they can constitute the same ecological effects overall, and something that we want to maintain for the species who need to be there. And so with all this being said, I set out some study objectives, which were to one, determine use of prescribed fire by African-American non-industrial private landowners, determine organizations and affiliations for prescribed fire information, which I don't touch on as much in this presentation, and then determine how to maximize outreach and then examine cultural values. So this right here is an image of the 52 county conservation planning area that Tall Timbers allow me to use. And I overlaid that with 2010 census data, with the darkest colored counties being highest and those who identified as African-American on the census, and the lighter colored counties being the lowest. So this was pretty much my starting point to go from the highest to the lowest and see where I could find. And then to find people to find participants for the rest of my study, I relied on the extension services, forest services, and word of mouth or snowball sampling pretty much to help guide me to additional participants. The data collection method, I recorded my interviews and I kept a personal journal, and I had a recruitment script that I gave everybody, and everybody was informed of the questions and everything beforehand and signed a letter of consent. And overall, how I structure my analyzation and my approach method for this was through rapid role appraisal, or RAA, and it's a rapid response data collection method for rural settings to obtain community perspectives, because I only really had 3 months to try to gain as much as possible from this group of landowners that is way more vast than simply I or anybody I was working with could get to at the time. But I think we still cover a lot of the ground. So on to the results. So this entire study resulted in a total of 21 participants who agreed to interview either in person, so I went to their land and learned about the way that they did things and understood their force and everything, or over the phone where we had the same conversation and the structured questions as well. 3 of the landowners that I interviewed worked on a tract encompassing over 1,000 acres, and they had worked there for decades, but the specific size and scope of those fires operationally was not directly applicable to their own property, say, that they had at home. But they were still a part of this prescribed fire narrative in this landscape and putting it on the ground, and also putting it on the ground in these really large places too. So you could see the difference between somebody who has worked on hundreds of thousands of acres versus somebody who's burning on their own smaller plot of land. A majority of my respondents were 50 plus and identified as men with land ownership ranging from 7 to 100 plus years, or centennial farmers in Georgia. And then land acreage varied from 0.5 acres to 365 acres. So each participant had a wide variety of management goals for their land, row crop agriculture, as I mentioned before, all the way to pollinator space. Also, now people have been growing hemp, so that's a new thing, as well as simply having aesthetic space for living, and still using fire in the same way. But some limitations to their management goals were personnel, permitting, and finances. And overall, a comment on their use of and thoughts surrounded prescribed fire. So in the interviews, 19% of participants did not use prescribed fire whatsoever, while 81% did use prescribed fire in some manner. And then 64% used fire on an annual, biannual schedule, similar to large fires conducted nearby. And 35.7% reported infrequent use of fire or extended absence use of fire for up to 30 years was my furthest out. So this information is critical because with more enclosed housing, even in more rural settings, the absence of fire on the landscape is creating even more room for wildlife-urban interfaces. So, so to kind of depict this infrequent use of fire on the landscape, I created this map here. And so this is showing all of the ones with fire symbols are occurring annually, and all of the ones that are flagged are the ones that are previously infrequent. And it is overlaid with the same census data that was shown on the image before. Lots of this is ongoing fires. And what's really cool, I thought, about the map is that seeing all of the fire infrequent and frequent together is showing that even where there is inconsistency in fire use, fire is still happening all around it. So the need and understanding for its regular use is continuous, even without the regular use by every single person in every county. And I have to be mindful of that too, because of how small my sample size was to understand really how it all could work together. So pretty much to quantify my results, to qualify my results during my analysis process, I used quotes from the landowners, and I separated the interview answers into three main themes that answer the study objectives. So one is evidence of prescribed fire use and motivations for that use. So one really great quote that I got from landowner was that they call it the wood rattlers. They keep look over the place like security. They mostly help burn, they ride along, throw a match out. And the area where we were sharecropping, my granddad, he used to burn. He used to walk around with a big old box of matches and then big old long matches and strike and just drop basically everywhere that we were farming. He would keep all that burnt. So one, we get what is the motivation for use? Farming, keeping that area clean, keeping that area pest free, keeping that area safe. And then you have the practitioners who, in this case, was the landowner's granddad, but in some other cases of landowners were Forest Service people or their cousin or anybody who knew of the key importance of use of fire on the landscape. And so then the second theme that I tracked was limitations and implications for policymakers. And I separated this into education, legacy, and underrepresentation because I felt that those addressed it best. And so these quotes here reflect underrepresentation, which is not an initial question that I had in my subset when I started to do the research, but I found it even more important as I was going through, because it seemed that there were challenges for these African-American landowners that were specific to an experience, were specific to a history, as I laid out to you before. And so those needed to be addressed. But quite simply put, Landowners said, no, it's not enough representation for the dark or Black people. And then, yeah, no, it's two different worlds. You're still in this world and they're still in another world, speaking racially, socially, and financially. And then lastly was the theme of cultural values of land ownership and fire. And something that I found, I love this image because I got to meet all of these cows and they were really awesome cattle members. But so the landowner says, you know, God ain't making no more land. So I think land is a precious thing and one of the most precious commodities that he has left us with. And what I found overall, and I think that's something very clear through landowners, is that there's a deep devotion to the land, but there's also this deep devotion to get this land to the next generation, where a lot of these African-American non-industrial private landowners have done so much work to get to this point, to have this land, to maintain this land, and want to see this land through to the next generation. And that is some places where it falls short, and some are not able to, but are doing their best in this time to push that narrative forward and to get more Black landowners in the mix, to get them knowledgeable about this form of land management, and to be the next generation who continues to not only put fire on the land, but make sure the land is well maintained. So through all the trials and tribulations, there is a consciousness and a diligence to working and providing for that land. And so these quotes and additional ones collected help me consider implications for policymakers. And so some of these were, for one, to localize efforts and partner with local organizations to aid landowners with access to information. So two that I discovered during this research process was SAFON, which is an organization in the Southeast based in Atlanta, and they specifically work with organic farming for African-American landowners, and as well the Southern Federation of Cooperatives that works actively to provide information on policy and finances and credit and USDA information for landowners, working with those groups to get access to those information, and also working with landowners who have local groups where they share information through. The second is offering education catered to small burn holdings, state level permitting processes, safe burning practices, fire weather, and smoke liability. And then additionally, providing African-Americans, Afro-descendants, Black landowners overall to purchase Black-owned lands. So, and a step towards this has been the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, which has been enacted in 19 states, including Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. And just recently, USDA has discussed some implementation strategy for their heirs property relending program. And then lastly, something that I think has been covered overall is our outreach and our active engagement with rural, suburban, and urban communities of color from a not tokenizing and an equitable lens. And again, through those organizations that also help foster and feed that information. So to conclude, there are still longstanding issues like racism, venture capitalism, and heirs property that limit land ownership, and thus limit preferential prescribed fire use, management, and maintenance. Even so, wildfire in the West and prescribed fire among large landholdings in the Southeast, like plantations, tree farms, and habitat conservation, will continue. And nonetheless, due to their history, location, and natural fabric, generations of African-American landowners and descendants have and will use fire on their land, and their continuation of such practice highlights their unique experiences and collective burn stories. So I hope that this was insightful, and now I will take any questions or comments.
Thank you, LaPortia. We have one question and a comment from Monica. She said, thank you for sharing your important work, which I agree. Thank you so much. And then she asked who you've been collaborating with down at Tall Timbers. Also, since you have an artistic background, do you have any creative outreach exhibits / products / projects planned or in the works to share your findings?
So Kevin Hires was who I worked with at Tall Timbers. I was working with him and others in the fire ecology lab. So he's like my bud, I would say. And then in terms of artistic works related to my project specifically, no, I don't. I'm really in the process of trying to publish. Got a rejection today, but that's okay. I'm really trying to get my work published and trying to see if there's going to be a next level to this work that maybe expands to more of the Southeast through a PhD project or something. I'm still exploring it, and I'm also still trying to follow the policy as it's changing present day, as it relates to Black people and land. So yeah.
Great. And we have one more quick question. How do you best recommend to share this information with landowners that need it? And how can we reach those landowners you mentioned who need additional training?
I think it's gonna definitely be through, I think it's gonna be through already the mechanism that we do. The last presentation focused a lot on just building, as towards the end was talking a lot about that outreach. And I think that outreach piece is really key. A lot of the landowners I interacted with, these were one-off conversations. These were, I knew a friend who knew a friend who knew of me, who knew my family, who knew. So I think it's starting to bridge those gaps, to talk to people that you've never spoken to before, and to really address the concerns that were on the table. Management concerns are probably easy and key to get at when we go to individual landowners and what they want for their land. So maybe starting there and starting that initial conversation and expressing how prescribed fire can be a part of that narrative if that's the ecosystem they're in, or what other facets that you can add to them. But I really think it's a lot of time, connection, and relationships that we have to build, because there is a long history and there's a long set of feelings and emotions and descendants that are there. And I think we just have to be the next foot in the door to say, hello, like, I would like to speak to you about these things, and come the best that we are, and to all achieve the same goal.
Yeah, absolutely. That quote that you put, God ain't making no more land, it reminded me of something that Tommy said this morning about the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians and their just sort of rights and responsibilities to care for the land too. There's some resonance there for me.
Most definitely.
Thank you so much.